So today we're going to be talking about building and strengthening adult communities. In the responsive classroom approach, which has been in place for 40 years in schools across the country, and actually it's around the world right now, expanded from being an elementary approach, and we're now a K-8 approach. We have a number of practices that have been strongly put in place for adults as well as for students. And when we put those pieces in place for adults, we can also show how we can use these same practices to build our adult communities. So today we're going to take those practices, responsive classroom principles, strategies, and practices, and we're going to talk about how we can use them to get results of strengthening that community with our staff right away, for those of us that are still in the remote school approach, and also take a look at our future. Again, not knowing what the future of schools is going to look like in the fall, but giving kind of both lenses in a remote setting and then also in an in-person setting. The second goal for today is to really think about the responsive classroom approach and how it applies to our leadership skills. Much of what we learn in this approach is for adult leadership of students. But how can we use those same skills in many ways to transform our work with adults that we work with in classrooms and in the whole school setting? And finally, the last goal is to engage you in time of reflection and also engage you in time with planning conversations. So you'll have 2 breakout sessions, like I said, where you'll get a chance to meet other leaders that are part of this group of learners today. But there'll be times along the way where we're going to pause and give you some time to reflect and to think about, make some applications to now or into the future. So I said it a little bit before, but I just want everyone to be thoughtful of it. I want you to be ready to do some of that reflection by having a piece of paper or 2 handy. I'm going through my color paper stash, so I've got some bright yellow stuff here today for a Thursday. If you don't have anything handy, just step away and get that now and something to write with. So based on these goals, you dedicated 90 minutes of your time today to join us together for the Responsive Classroom Leadership webinar. What is your goal for today? What is your hope that at the end of our 90 minutes today that you're able to take away based on these goals to your work in strengthening those adult communities? Take a minute right now to write that goal on a piece of paper. And I'm going to be pausing at that time so you can really articulate and imagine what your goal is that you're trying to achieve. So this has been an interesting series of 3 leadership webinars. And, through difficulty comes change. And this is our first time trying this kind of approach to support leaders. So as some of you may have engaged with this work in the previous 2 weeks, and if you're new here, we invite you as well. The audience may include people who are new to Responsive Classroom and just checking Responsive Classroom out, and maybe people that are well steeped in the responsive classroom approach. This is for all of you, by the way. So thank you for those that are coming back, and thank you for everybody that's trusting to take your time today with this work. To help you achieve your goal, everybody that's here today, we're going to use some group guidelines to support that work. And actually group guidelines for adults is something we're going to talk about today to kind of help you think about how do guidelines for working with adults support the work that we're trying to do in our schools as well. I'm going to briefly go through the adult guidelines. First of all, take care of your learning and personal needs. We're all probably learning from some unique spot in our home. I see a beautiful outside view that somebody made a good choice, and maybe some tropical place, wherever that is. But we're going to try to take care of our families or whoever else needs us in our homes at the same time you're trying to do your best learning. So as you do that, feel free to do what you need to do to be as present as possible. I'm also going to use these words, challenge by choice. As we enter into the breakout rooms, sometimes people are really comfortable in breakout rooms, and sometimes they want to just use that short amount of time to do some reflection or take care of something else, maybe need their own need a break from the amount of technology. So if you join us in the breakout room, please participate. And if you decide to take that time as a break, just don't join the room when you're invited, and you'll probably have stopped video. If you're not comfortable being in the group and you just want to stay in the main group, I stay back there so I can chat with you if you just want to do that as well. The second guideline is to respect and support others. So right now, it's like you're kind of all on your own wherever you are. But when we get into that breakout room, that's a great time to get connected with some other leaders. The first thing you want to do when you get in that breakout room is to do a little bit of an introduction. Hi, my name is Margie. I call it like that cocktail party introduction. I'm from Wisconsin and I'm a consulting teacher. So do a quick introduction and try to do that personal connection before you reply to the prompt. So introduce yourself and reply to the prompt. The other thing that can happen when you get into breakouts is there really isn't a good time to ask for clarification for the question. So you kind of trust that the other people in the group will know it. So when you get into that time, just try your best to be present. And I will give a couple of prompts as to what the question is before you go to breakout. When you also get into the breakout room, that's a great time to make sure that you are sharing video, and also you can unmute yourself so you can have those conversations. And finally, the last one, take care of your learning materials and space. That's kind of done. You don't really have a lot of materials, and this is your own space. But I want you to feel comfortable where you're at and know that sometimes people are trying to take notes down as they're watching, and I totally respect and understand that. I'm going to give you some times where you can do some of that reflecting. But you will all receive a copy of the webinar today. So you'll be able to use this as you need when you return to whatever role that you have back at school. I'm going to right now show you the main resource I'm using today, just because people usually have that a question along the way. I'm going to be using some resources from the book Energize Your Meetings. This is a book for responsive classroom. It's designed to use interactive learning structures for educators. So it's designed for leaders to lead with other educators. So as we move into the work that we're doing, take a minute to just, I'll say 30 seconds, to just reflect on these group guidelines. How will a Zoom webinar following these group guidelines help you to stay engaged and achieve your goal today? Just take about 20 seconds to reflect on what it'll look like, sound like, and feel like to use these group guidelines. So hopefully, even though, like I said, Zoom webinars might not be the best way to join in on learning for responsive classroom, I'm going to say personally as a presenter, I'd much rather have you all in one room, but it certainly has given us an opportunity to be a little bit more far reaching. And kind of, I think as adult learners, it gives us time to do a little bit more self-reflecting. So today, as we talk about the topic of building and strengthening our adult communities, it's a great time to do some self-reflecting as well. The responsive classroom approach is a focus. It's a focus on taking the work that we do in a school and focus on a strong core belief that joins us all together. There's a lot of power when you implement responsive classroom in a classroom. It's incredible when a teacher takes those skills and brings it into a classroom. And then there's something even more incredible when a whole school can put all that effort in. So today, as you think about this, depending upon the role you have in your school, maybe it's something you consider more at a smaller scale or a larger scale. The core belief, though, that drives all the work of every adult that uses responsive classroom is this, that in order for it to be successful inside and outside of school, students need both social-emotional competencies and academic competencies. In the work of responsive classroom, not only do we believe it's important that students learn the 5 social-emotional competencies of cooperation, assertiveness, responsibility, empathy, and self-control, we believe it's our duty to teach them and to give them the opportunity to practice and be successful. Same thing with academic competencies. Schools we're focused on academic achievement. That becomes a lot of our measures. But in order for students to have a high level of achievement, they need both those social, emotional, and academic competencies. Academic competencies of an academic mindset, seeing that they belong in school, that they have the potential to have success that is meaningful to them. Perseverance, that they have the ability to push themselves through challenge, that learning is supposed to be on the edge of challenge. That they have learning strategies. Even the new technologies have taken a lot of new learning strategies, adults as well as the students, but to problem solve, to access new information, to store information, and to retrieve it. And academic behaviors, often the given, but they're also what we sometimes get the most frustrated with students. Being on time, being in school every day, being prepared for school. And right now, and talking to educators that I know that I work with during this time of quarantine, is those academic behaviors have really changed for both adults and for students and really have become a challenge. May is always a hard time to keep our students engaged and motivated for learning. It's also a really hard time for educators because a lot of times that place of burnout kind of comes along. But now add the uniqueness of this global pandemic. Looking at that core belief, if that's our true north, if that's what all of us that are working on this approach are driving towards, what do we as the adults do? And we call those our guiding principles. This guides the work that we do. In previous webinars, I've talked about different ones, and there's a couple of them I'm going to emphasize more today. But first of all, number one is teaching social emotional skills is as important as teaching the academic content. Those 5 social and emotional skills: cooperation, assertiveness, responsibility, empathy, self-control, are taught to every student every day, and they're taught by all adults. A lot of it's anchored in the morning meeting and responsive advisory meeting, but the little everyday moments are powerful time to teach those skills and then also to give kids practice and feedback. The second one, how we teach is as important as what we teach. As we're finding that now, even in this remote learning time, we're kind of finding we have to have new ways to teach. This work in our professional development, we know the value of standards and content, but we're going to really dive into it, especially today, taking some time to talk about how can we teach those standards and content? How can we teach the skills in a way that students can master that information and retain it and take it to that higher level of thinking? The third one, the greatest cognitive growth occurs through social interaction. Remote learning's really challenged that. A remote webinar really challenges that, but we're going to put those pieces in place today and really talk about how we can build structures that actually focus on the number 2 guiding principle that give us that same ability where we can strengthen our use of those social interactions for cognitive growth. The fourth one, and I think there's only 6 guiding principles, how powerful this is, but it's about the adult community. How we as adults work together to create those safe, joyful, inclusive learning environments is as important as each of our individual competencies and our contributions. It's a challenge right now. Schools, people are divided. Talked to a 2nd grade teacher yesterday who's going in to clean up her room, and she said, I'm the only teacher in the whole school. It's so odd. But it's hard to strengthen those communities when we're remote, although it's possible. But we also might be taking the time today to think about how we can do that for the fall if we're in person again. The last 2 aren't going to be the strongest amount that we're talking about, would definitely apply to them. What we know and believe about our students individually, culturally, developmentally, it forms our expectations, our reactions, and our attitudes about our students. And the 6th one, partnering with families, knowing them, and valuing their contributions is as important as knowing the children we teach. So I hope I just kind of taking time to reflect on some of these, and I know some of you have been part of this before, but it's just realizing the power of our work and what we do, both remotely and in person, is what gets us to that change. So this is what it looks like in the responsive classroom approach. That whole last slide, those core beliefs and guiding principles, along with researched and practiced responsive classroom teaching practices, create that responsive classroom approach. Responsive classroom isn't a program, it's an approach. So the approach that we use in classrooms at all levels is something that we're also going to talk about how we can use some of those same practices to support our adult community and strengthen our adult community. And the responsive classroom approach is not just about building positive community. I'm saying that word a lot, I realize. But it's also about how we can engage in academics. And we'll talk about that today, about the learning that we expect our adults to do and how we can support that. It also has to do with effective management. In-person school or remote school all rely on effective management, often coming from our school leaders. And it has to be developmentally responsive. I was even thinking today, if I did some of and you'll learn from some of my mistakes, but if I would use some of the practices I'd use with students with the adults that are joining me today, you might turn off right away and say, I'm not doing any of these crazy things. So it's developmentally responsive today for adults. The beauty of that responsive classroom approach, and that's, I'm kind of pointing to the circle, but I feel like is it's designed for every child to be successful. It's for every student, every day, and every adult that uses this approach has that same belief that every child can be successful. I'm going to turn that a little bit though now to think about our teachers, and I'm going to use the word teachers inclusively. Teachers as any adult that works in a school, because they're all teaching our children. If we believe that every teacher every day can be successful in the same way, how can we approach that so that we have that same level of success? So take a look again back at your goal and what I just shared with you. Make a connection with the information I shared with you about responsive classroom, and look at how any of the parts I just talked to you about will help you achieve your goal. And this was going to be just a short reflection, take about 15 seconds. All right, so now we're going to dig into the content for today. I'm going to have you create your own graphic organizer on your piece of paper. And how you're going to do it is you're going to take a piece of paper and divide it into 3 columns, so with 2 lines. Sometimes people just like to fold the paper and make it in 3 lines. Let's see if I can do this okay. You have 3 columns. Now you're going to turn your paper, so whatever way you had it, and you're going to create 3 more columns. So it's going to kind of look like a tic-tac-toe board that takes up your whole piece of paper. And you've just created 9 boxes. And now I'm going to tell you what you're going to do with those 9 boxes. When we talk about whether it's children's behavior or adults' behavior, what leads to behavior is motivation. And what motivates our behavior is a need to meet basic human needs. I think back to my college education classes and educational psychology, they talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how that bottom layer of needs had to be met in order for students to get to that level of self-actualization. The bottom level is those sense of safety, and then all of the needs of water, air, all those kinds of things, physiological needs, I guess. But right above those levels is that need to feel like you belong, a need of significance. Adults and children have that same need, a need to feel like they're being significant, that they belong, and they have a sense of fun. Across the top of your sheet right now, and your top can either be the skinny way or the long way, doesn't matter. But in the first column on the top, label it significance. The second one, write belonging. And the third column, write fun. And like I said, doesn't matter which direction you're going. Fun, belonging, significance. I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about these in general, and then we're going to talk about some specific things that we can do to meet the needs of significance, belonging, and fun. When I talk about the general, the needs will be met. Adults need to have these needs met just as children. Sometimes those needs get met in a real productive way, that naturally someone can productively have their need of significance met. But because it's going to be met, if it's not easily met in the setting that they're in, sometimes we use inappropriate behavior or non-productive behavior. I wouldn't say inappropriate, but non-productive behavior to have that need met. So what am I talking about? So significance is that need to be seen, to be noticed, to have a voice, to be known. Significance in a school can look like everybody in the school has a name tag with their name on it. So that when you meet somebody in the hall, and I'm talking about the adults now, that there's kind of an expectation that you greet people and say their first name. So in the hall, somebody says, hi, Margie. And when everybody's got the expectation that we equally are part of that community, you get that sense of being significant. I'll talk about some other successful ways to build in that need to be significance, But know when that need to have significance is met, then the non-productive behaviors aren't needed to meet that need. So what does it look like if you have that need and it's not productive? Sometimes, and I'll see it in professional development settings, or I might see it in a staff meeting, someone that needs to be significant, if that need isn't being met, maybe monopolizes conversations, is constantly drawing things toward themselves because they have that need of significance. One staff that I saw, there was a staff member who was constantly late. And what people realized is that part of her being late was her way of being seen by walking into meetings late. And a third thing, in a school culture, sometimes significance is met by people who voice contrary vote all the time, or they're the naysayers. And sometimes they get their significance met by just being contrary, disagreeing with what's being done. We're going to talk about doing some activities that you can do with your staff. And there are some people that get kind of proud saying, I'm never doing one of those. And that might be their way of having their need of significance met. The second one, belonging. And you can jot any of these ideas down and I'll tell you what we'll do next with them. That sense of being part of a group, of the whole school community, or in a small group. To be knowing you're part of a member, that you're welcomed in, a place is made for you when you're joined in. That sense of being missed when you're not there, and cared for if you're not quite yourself. Some of the ways I've seen belonging happen is in a school that made sure that every adult every year and every student got the mascot t-shirt every year to wear, the new t-shirt. Before, they were just for sale as a fundraiser, and just a few kids would get them, or a few adults would get them. Not everybody's finances were the same. So this principal found a way to find money for every adult to have the same t-shirt, and every child to have the same t-shirt. And then when they had their school spirit days, everyone wore something. So they all felt like they had this sense of belonging. Those same people that are contrary, though, they might find a sense of belonging by finding other people that are also contrary. So finding that group that might be negative as well. And then you can guess that can be kind of part of a problem. And finally, fun. Now, some schools just have the fun, I swear. Some people bring the fun to a group. But when you have a sense of fun, it isn't an all-out party, but it really is a sense of joyfulness, of playfulness, of a sense of taking risks, of being vulnerable. And when it comes to fun, sometimes we arrange things that we think are fun for everybody, but not everybody can be included. So then we might have the fun, but we also might exclude people. So we want to make sure we do that. Another school I saw that one way they had built the fun, and this became a tradition, is that every year the 5th grade students would play the staff in a basketball game. So the whole gym filled up with all the students. Any staff member or even after school staff member that wanted to play basketball could play basketball. And some of the staff helped out and were part of the halftime show with some of the students. And some just helped the students make posters and cheer and know what basketball game etiquette was. And the funny thing is, in this one, the principal shared with me that even one of the games, the school police liaison officer played in the basketball game in uniform. So it was quite the interesting thing. If we don't provide the fun, people will find ways to have fun, and sometimes that's not a way to build your community. I know one way, there was a group that was playing jokes on people at our school, and people were becoming offended by some of the jokes. So what's one person's fun isn't always everybody's fun. Now we're going to move into how we're going to use our tic-tac-toe board, I guess, in another way. So I'm going to talk about some strategies for success. And in these same areas of significance, belonging, and fun, I'm going to give you some examples of responsive classroom practices that can be done remotely and in person, And you're going to jot down ideas under where they meet significance, belonging, and fun. And if you're not sure, this isn't a quiz. Where you put them is not. As I talk about this, I'm going to give you some time for pause and thinking for you to jot down what this brings up as you're thinking of it too. You might have some great ideas of how you use these things either remotely or in person. And after we do our tic-tac board, build this after this slide, we're going to be moving into a swap meet in a breakout room. So as you think about this, start thinking about which idea you want to be prepared to share with others. So interesting times calls for interesting ways to try to meet significance, belonging, and fun. One of the ways that schools that have found success with doing this, though, is to use some of the practices of responsive classroom to set their school up for success with adult norms. One school that I was working with, they had started out by reading a book to get to the whole school. Actually, she started reading it to her school staff at one of the first staff meetings to kind of launch out, like, what's the theme going to be for this year? And the year that I worked with her, she read the book Ish. If you're familiar with the book Ish, it's about supporting a little girl with her artwork by saying everything is something ish and it keeps getting better. She's like, well, we're going to have responsive classroom ish as we strengthen our work today. And then she asked every adult to say, what is your hope and dream for how we're going to work together in the school this year? And they posted their hope and dream on a little flower piece of paper and shared their hope and dream with a few people. And she made a bulletin board out of those ideas. Now we've got some ways that we want to work together. So how do we take that to build adult norms? So adult norms is the same as guidelines. People might call them agreements or rules. The word isn't as important as knowing what they are. They're what we agree upon to help us achieve those hopes and dreams. I've also seen schools make that hope and dream be about what's the learning we want from the school this year. So it's more student focused than staff focused. And when it was student focused, it was posted on a big bulletin board as soon as you walked into the school, and the kids could see a picture of a staff member and what their hope and dream was for them for the school year, which was also really powerful. Again, the same conversation. What are the guidelines that are going to get us to that? This is an important process because it also kind of models what we do with students, but it involves that level of significance, hearing everyone's ideas and voice, and belonging, that we all work on the same guidelines together to make it powerful and fun. And knowing that as we create those adult norms and guidelines, sometimes just listening to that process take place kind of pulls the onion back a little bit to say, okay, what is part of this culture that needs to be addressed? When I was working with the staff one time, people, after they started having trust with each other, had said, we get so negative. And what can we say to do that? So one of the most powerful guidelines they had, and it's not words they created because we've heard them out there, is to always assume positive intentions. And to always know that everything has a backstory. But if we assume positive intentions, this was the same staff that highly dependent on chocolate for every staff meeting. So the beginning of their guidelines was while eating chocolate, and then they had listed the other ones. So they also made it fun. Another staff that the principal had shared with me that they had done is after they created their guidelines, they wanted to have a little fun. So they divided the group up into, there were 5 guidelines, so 5, and each group had to come up with a cheer for their guideline. And then they led the group in a cheer. So they built in the fun while they're doing the belonging and the significance. Now, as you can guess, building adult norms isn't the same as using adult norms. So as you create those adult norms as a group, really be honest and upfront and questioning what's the process we're going to use to make sure that we follow these adult norms so that we can achieve our goals. One school that I worked with, they read the adult guidelines at the beginning of every meeting. They'd ask for a volunteer, read the adult guidelines. Another school, they printed them up every year on fancy paper, and they were posted all over the school, and each teacher had a copy of the guidelines. A principal that I worked with, she said she takes her adult guidelines and pulls one out in her Monday memos that she puts out and just says, this week we're going to be working on this. This might be a good time to think about this guideline. What might it look like? What might it sound like? And then the toughest part, and this could be a whole nother webinar, I think, is what happens when those guidelines aren't followed. Because if we look the other way, whenever a guideline isn't followed, we're all responsible, all the adults that agree to those guidelines. We're not living the guideline what they're intended for. So jot down a minute, just your thoughts under significance, belonging, and fun. What might be some ways that using adult norms might be a positive success strategy at your school? I have to say this was one of the things I loved doing as a principal. I would spend the summer trying to find a really good picture book. The other principal leaders, like somebody had done the book-ish, but I'd even go to a local bookstore where it was a teacher that led the bookstore. I said, okay, I need a new children's book. What's a book that I can motivate the staff with? And she would help me find a new book every year. And then often I'd read that same book and go into each classroom at the beginning of the year as well. All right, the second strategy for team success is giving voice and choice. So when we can empower the adults that we work with by having a voice in decisions and anything that we do in the school whenever possible, and having some choices. So what might that look like? When we're trying to come up with a decision-making process, we need to be really transparent in how decisions are going to be made. Whenever possible, if we can have voices from the adults in on those decisions, we're going to strengthen that adult community. One strategy that some schools use is a consensus voting approach called a fist to five. And what that looks like is we're going to agree on a decision right now. The recommendation is that we move our recess up to be before lunch. We go through discussions, hear people's voices. What could that mean? And now we're going to show our vote for consensus. It's not a majority rules. A group decides what percentage of consensus they need. And in this case, the school said 85% of a 3 or more. And I'll show you what that means. So everybody shows on their hands. They either strongly agree, or 4 fingers, mostly agree, somewhat agree, disagree, strongly disagree, so that everybody has a voice. 85% of those would be 3 fingers or above. If somebody puts up a fist, that means it's a block to that consensus. Somebody has a different idea. So if they block, we have to stop and hear that additional idea. Depending upon the size of a team, a small team, everybody has a voice. If you have a larger staff that you're working with, you might have to have representatives. So for example, if we're moving our lunch and our recess hour, we might have to have, it's important to have a representative who would represent the cafeteria staff, the kitchen staff, the supervisors, grade level teams, specialist teams, anybody that would be impacted by it, so it could be a group decision. And then the other idea of having choice. So when we can plan professional development around the idea of choice, we have more buy-in. Schools that I work with that are implementing responsive classroom often spend some of their first professional development growing morning meeting or growing responsive advisory at the middle school. But if my background was a speech and language therapist, I might not do a morning meeting. So I might not be as engaged in that topic because that's not my role. So what a school did is they said, this is our main building goal this year, is to strengthen morning meetings or responsive advisories. What are some topics for professional development? Well, maybe if I'm a special education teacher, I want to know how my IEP goals can connect with the activities and the parts of a morning meeting or advisory. If I'm a specialist teacher, I might want to know how can I build those pieces into my art, music, or PE. And if I'm maybe the office staff or the hourly staff that support students, what can I do to support the same goals that students are working on in their morning meeting? And once people have voice and choice, immediately there's more engagement. So by getting voice, they have a sense of significance. By being in a group that agrees with them and has the same goal in mind, they have a sense of belonging. And then you can always add a little fun by adding a little activity to it as well. And of course, the last goal is promote team fun. And it doesn't mean just team fun. It really means a sense of fun and playfulness. We know that emotions and hormones really impact how our brain learns. That happens to adults in school. That happens to adults in professional development. We can read it. I'm only seeing a few of your faces while I'm presenting right now. But when you're presenting or talking to a group of educators, whether it's in a staff meeting or if it's in PD, you can tell when the emotions are strong. So how can we change that? Sometimes we build in a routine of having some type of energizer into a meeting or a brain break. And again, build the ones that are trusting. I know when I led my staff meetings at my school, we started with a routine every time where we do parts of a morning meeting, but we always had time for celebration. And sometimes it'd be a goofy little celebration like, oh, my youngest son finally moved out of the house. I'm now an empty nester. But it was a way for people to say, haha, that's fun. Or it might be one of the teachers saying, I finally moved out of my parents' house. So, same kind of thing. And by doing the same kinds of things we expect people to do for the students, it also says we're all in this together. You get that same sense as a leader of how vulnerable you feel if you're going to lead everybody in a double this activity in an after school staff meeting or a professional development. And you're going to have an empathy for the risks that we're expecting teachers to take in their classroom if they're implementing some of the activities that we're talking as well. And remotely, this was one, a friend of mine who's a principal, I asked her the other day, I said, well, what do you do to make these meetings not seem so dreadful? She said, well, I have to get creative. She says, one day I even just said, okay, everybody, you're all here right now. Go to your refrigerator and bring the weirdest thing that you have in your refrigerator and show it in the screen, and we're all going to try to guess what it is. So she said everybody left and they came back and had some odd thing from the refrigerator. But strange times call for unique measures, so we get a chance to do that. All right, take a look at your tic-tac-toe board. I promised you a breakout room. We're going to do that right now. So as we get into a breakout room, what you're going to do is you're going to get a chance to do what's called a swap meet. I'm going to show you on the next slide what the questions are, so you're going to be prepared. All right, let's go to the next slide. As you look at the next slide, you're going to see that you're going to have a chance to share. Of course, your clicker doesn't want to work when you want it to work. I'll just read you the questions because it'll work eventually. You're going to share an idea that you have in your tic-tac-toe board about how you could use one of these strategies for a virtual setting with adults, or how you could use it for an in-person setting. So it could be in a team meeting, it could be in, there you go, it could be in a staff meeting, it could be in a professional development group that you're having. So think about which idea and then which format. I'm gonna leave those questions there for you to think for a minute. When I enter you into a breakout room, the first thing you're going to do is decide who goes first. So in this case, it's going to be by alphabetical order based on your first name. And then just go in order based in alphabetical order based on your first name. So if your name begins with an A, you're probably going to be one of the first people that goes. Just kind of makes it easier. When it's your turn, do that quick introduction and then do kind of a 1 or 2 sentence share, because you'll have about a minute for a participant to share. You'll see a countdown clock that'll show you how much time when you get down to 1 minute. So do make sure everybody's included. And again, before you get there, also take time to make sure that you have what you want to share. But when you get there, unmute and show who you are, because we want to see you. So I got a chance to look at the chat, and one of the questions that came up in the chat while you were in the groups that I wanted to just talk about is, if you have the same group of staff, do you keep creating new guidelines every year? And that actually happened when I was a principal, that we're like, okay, do we just keep using, because it was a process that seemed to take a while. And what we realized is that the years that we didn't do the process, they weren't as robust, and it felt like they didn't have the same meaning when we just said, we did these last year, let's approve them again. So I think the process, at least in the building where I was a principal, was really valuable, but sometimes we changed the process. So one year we used the 5 CARES words, and we broke the staff up in groups, and one group came up with a guideline for cooperation for the adults. One came up with a guideline for assertion, one for responsibility. Another year, we did a different way of consolidating and said, we're going to really try to narrow these down to fewer words. Because when we have 30 words as our guidelines, we can't remember any of them. So they took guidelines, but they really pulled out the important words. And even the years that we did try using the same guidelines, we did this thing called either a T chart or a Y chart. What is this guideline going to look like and sound like when we're using this guideline? And for a Y, it's look like, sound like, and feel like when we're using this guideline. And at first it can feel like it is hard for people, but I've had people who would come up to me who had joined like from other schools and said, I'm so glad that we talk about this at our school, because when you don't talk about it, that's what takes over your school, is how the adults work together. So you just shared your expertise and your thoughts and ideas of how you could use these guidelines with your staff, the ideas, the strategies for success. And now that you've had a chance to kind of share and hear some other ideas, we're going to talk about one more way that you can use one of the responsive classroom practices that you can use to strengthen the work that you're doing. In the responsive classroom approach, an engaging academic strategy we use is called interactive learning structures. Interactive learning structures are used at the K-8 level. And if you've been part of a responsive classroom workshop, you know they're also a tried and true part of our adult workshops as well. And when we can build in the interactive learning structures for adults, those needs of significance, belonging, and fun can be met within our instructional settings. So whether it's a staff meeting or a professional development center setting that we're in, we can build in this type of learning. And because it's one of the practices that we teach in our responsive classroom trainings as well, by seeing one of the leaders using these approaches in our work with adults, it really legitimizes it for use with students as well. I'll often say when I do a training, how did it feel to learn this way? And most of the time people will sit back and they'll say, wow, that was really different. That's not how I'm used to learning at a PD session, or the time went so fast. This is an excerpt from the book that I showed you before, Energize Your Meetings. Take a minute and read this paragraph from the book and reflect on how this might impact the work that you're doing with the adults in your school. So when we build a positive community, when we focus on the adults that work in our school, and that's all the adults that work in our school. One of our visions of a positive school culture is having that positive environment where we are able to be vulnerable, to take risks, to be honest even with our frustrations, to have respectful dialogue, so that whenever we're together in a learning setting, that our work is meaningful and productive. And that's hard. I just know as a leader of professional development and also as a leader of staff meetings, often after school, it was hard to keep adults engaged. So how can we do that and really honor the uniqueness and challenges that adults are having now in this time of remote learning, and then when we return back to school? One of my big realities that I had the other day is that no matter if we're remote school or in-person school in the fall, it's going to be a whole new experience. Whatever happens, our students have experienced something else. All of us as adults have experienced something else. And the way we're going to have to change some practices, routines is going to feel uncomfortable for us as well as students. And sometimes as a leader, I can put pieces in place and think, okay, everybody's going to do it and they're going to all get on board, and realize that some people are going to have a struggle with that. So think about the importance of being heard, of having the ability to feel like I'm part of this decision, and a strategy to make sure that we see all sides of an issue. Interactive learning structures are powerful for not just making our meetings have more engaged learning activities, but also about hearing the voice from everybody. I'm going to go through these 5 topics today. And as we talk about them, I'm going to connect to some examples of interactive learning structures that we use in the responsive classroom approach. They're all from the book Energize Your Meetings. And if you're familiar with the responsive classroom approach at the elementary level, you might have heard them use. This is the book Joyful Classroom. Many of these are used by teachers as well. And this book is designed for elementary teachers. I don't have the book in front of me, but if you're at the middle school level, the book Middle School Motivators has very similar ones. So as I'm saying that these are designed for adults, they're designed for all learners. When we establish an opportunity for learning with adults, we have different goals or purposes. How can we build interactive learning structures into either the beginning of that learning, the middle of the learning, or in the end? So I'm going to share some ideas, and then you're getting a chance to do another interactive learning structure yourself with some adults that are part of our group here. So the first one is, many times when we have our staff together, we're trying to learn something new. I can imagine that when we get together in the fall, that we're going to have to learn something new about hand washing. So having some expectations for how we're going to make sure that our school is more sanitary and socially spaced. One way of doing that is an interactive learning structure called a circle map. So as we learn some new information and it's presented, a lot of times it's that sit and get kind of presentation, that we use either on individual papers or group a chart paper, draw a big circle with the topic in the middle. So if we said safe hand washing, as we talk about the content that we're presenting, we can add in those different things that we're talking about. And then the power of a circle map is sharing the ideas with other people, especially if we're doing it as a group, but even individually. And then to look at the categories, like grouping them together. Oh, a lot of us are concerned about where we're going to do hand washing. A lot of us are concerned about how this is going to take away from some time if we spend that much more time on hand washing. Another way that we take adults into that learning mode is to deepen understanding on a topic. So as we think about the impact of social distancing, we say when we return to school, one of the things we may need to do is apply that developmentally to different ages. So how are we going to practice social distancing with our kindergartners versus our 6th graders? So even though we might be talking about social distancing, we might want to look at it through the lens of the book Yardsticks. The book Yardsticks in the Responsive Classroom Approach is used in every workshop and is written by author Chip Wood to look at the ages 4 to 14 and some common characteristics. Now we learn about it in our workshop, but we often don't pull it out again, it seems like. And if we could do that in our staff meetings and say, okay, pick an age level that you're concerned about social distancing. Look at what we know about 9-year-olds. Now you might want to look about what they do about 10-year-olds and do that same thing we just talked about with the swap meet, either in a remote setting or an in-person setting, and try to fill in as many ages as you can. How is social distancing going to impact students at every age? If you publicize it, if you wrote up what was learned at the end, think about how helpful that might be for parents, for those educators that work at a number of levels, like our specialists, or even like our cafeteria or supervisory staff, or even our bus drivers, if we could have that information available to them. A third characteristic is, or purpose, of interactive learning structures is we can reflect on learning and we can develop action steps. I'm sure you did that when you moved into remote learning when about the middle of March. you had to do some type of coming up with action steps. Quite likely, you had to, as a leader, come up with those action steps. But now as we move ahead, I know I'm talking to educators are saying, okay, I have a feeling we're going to do some type of mixed learning as we go, as we move ahead, either with additional use of technology and in-person learning. So what are going to be the action steps for that? One strategy to do that, if you're in an in-person setting, is to use an interactive learning structure called an inside-outside circle. Maybe there's things about this approach, and maybe that's not the best example of mixed learning, but it could be when we're back in school, to have half your staff form a circle and they face toward the outside. The other staff pair up with them around and form an inside circle. So you've got two circles, one inside the other, who now have formed partnerships. And as you ask questions about what might be the successes, what might be the challenges, what do we have to remember about the steps that are going to go into having successful mixed learning. And then to create new partnerships, to have everybody's voice be heard, to create that sense of belonging, is have either the inside or the outside circle move one direction. I found that if I always say outside circle to the right or inside circle to the right, they always get new partners. But if somehow I mix up the left and the right, they seem to come back to each other. The fourth purpose for interactive learning structures, fully knowing procedures and protocols. So maybe one of the procedures and protocols that we're going to focus on is how we're going to change up the lunch hour. Some new ways that we can make sure our lunch hour is going to be safe for everybody throughout the school. And we've got some pieces in place, but we want to think about all the things we haven't thought about. We could do a strategy of a carousel. The carousel is where you have chart paper around the room that you're in, and at the top of the chart paper have different topics. So one thing I might think about is how it's going to work for the younger students. Where's the safety going to be when it comes to hand washing for the lunch hour? How are we going to work when somebody brings in a cold lunch versus a hot lunch? Oh my goodness, are we going to go on field trips? What would the lunch hour look like for field trips? And on the top of each of those posters, you would have that topic. A group would go to that poster that would stick together, and they would talk about the protocols that would go along with each of them and things maybe we hadn't thought about, and jot down their ideas. 2 or 3 minutes. On a signal, they all move to a new poster around in a circle like a carousel. They read the topic, add some more ideas. And so in the end, you have everybody's voice and their ideas on every poster. So you'll hear lots of different thoughts from people. You also kind of have a permanent record of what those discussion points are. And think about what I talked about earlier, some of the people that have the naysayers or the people that are contrary, they have a chance to have their voice heard. And that voice is important to be heard, but it's heard in a respectful way. They don't have to have an opportunity to have kind of those negative conversations. And then the last one, solving a problem collaboratively. One of the things I know schools have talked about is, that spacing. How are they going to handle that when it comes to arrival and dismissal? Maybe they get the arrival figured out with staggered drop-offs or using different doors. But maybe dismissal is going to be a challenge. So those are decisions you have to have kind of before school starts. So maybe as a leader with a task group, you may have come up with what you think is the best solution. And a way to have everybody's voice in on that decision is to use an interactive learning structure called a standing vote. So everybody that's in the room right now, I'm not saying this to all of you, but I'm saying this if I was in a staff meeting. If this idea that I'm sharing represents you, please stand. So the recommendation is for staggered dismissal. Stand if you agree with that. You get an idea. All right, people sit down. If our recommendation is for youngest students to dismiss first, stand if you agree. And you may not have a time to get everybody's voice, but everybody will have a chance to hear, to make their voice known. So it'll be a way to just gather information, especially on some new initiative. And gosh, me just saying this right now makes me realize how many decisions schools and leaders are going to have to make in a really short amount of time when school starts. So how can we use these purposes and interactive learning structures, if we dig into this book or use some of the ideas that I shared, to help strengthen the learning that you're doing in your school?
Marjorie, I have a question.
Yes.
Some of these learning structures, take time. And a lot of times after school meetings are a half hour and people need to get home for picking up their kids or whatever. How do you adjust for that? Because a lot of times I find that when we get together as faculty, faculty needs some decompression time with each other and just, chatting for a couple of minutes. And then going into something. But these learning structures take time. And a lot of times, like you said, we have to make a decision within a shorter period than sometimes this allows us. So what is your thought on that?
Sandy, you said exactly what I'm going to talk to you about right now. So
Okay.
yeah, be patient for just a little bit.
Sure.
And then these will be great discussions to have with other leaders. But I faced the same thing. Our school day ended at 3:30 and our staff meetings would go till 5 o'clock. So definitely knew that people had places they had to go. But so for a couple things. First of all, be clear on the goals. Don't just do an interactive learning structure just to do an interactive learning structure. If you want input on some of these ideas, make sure you do it. Be sure you're clear on the meeting goals and the purpose of the interactive learning structure. I found that it helped to start slow. Maybe if I just started with partner shares, we're going to start with partner shares. That was a safe place to be. The second point here is consider potential challenges. Time, just like Sandy brought up, is a huge piece. If I'm looking at the content and the information I wanted to meet, I kind of had to juggle that. How much time is this interactive learning structure going to be? In the school that I was in, we had our staff meetings and professional development in the school library. I also had to make sure I had enough room in there. To be honest, I quit doing an inside-outside circle because I'd have to move the whole room around to create room for an inside-outside circle. But I still wanted to use some of the other strategies, and I found that even putting a chart paper in the middle of the table for a circle map was going to be a challenge. Well, I looked around the library. The library was full of about 4-foot high bookcases that were flat on top. So instead of having them sit at the tables and work on their chart paper, I just used the top of the bookcases as kind of standing places that they could go to work together. And then also consider your audience. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more because I think that one becomes a big piece. Our teachers are, they're the most important part of our school, obviously. But we have to really pay attention to where they're at the time that we're doing these. When I would have staff meetings in April or May, and I'm in Wisconsin, if it was a beautiful day outside, sometimes I would start with take a 5-minute outside walk and do an interactive learning structure that's called a walk and talk. And they appreciated the chance to just get outside, walk and talk for 5 minutes with the topic that they were supposed to talk about. Another thing that kind of happened is that sometimes I'd think something would be fun to try with them. So there was this one I learned about is in one of the elementary middle school books. It's called Barnyard Bedlam. And in Barnyard Bedlam, I passed out cards that everybody had the name of a farm animal. So you might be a dog or a cow or a duck. And you would find your other partners that were going to work in your group by all making your farm animal sound. So the people would either start barking or quacking or baaing or oinking. And about a third of the people thought it was fun. A third of the people kind of just did it. And a third of the people thought it was the most ridiculous thing I ever did. And you could tell were angry and put off by it. Well, how do you get into the content if you're upset about it? And how does a team where they're frustrated with their colleague because either they're too excited or not excited? I realized that wasn't an appropriate one to do for adults. Now, this is the same team that said that everything had to start with chocolate. So I had another idea for the next time. I bought several bags of Dove chocolate, you know how they're different colors, and passed out the chocolate. And based on the color of chocolate you had, you had to meet with a group of the same colored chocolate. And when you got your group together, you could eat the chocolate and read the message that was inside the piece of paper, the wrapper. So it just made it a little bit more responsive to the adults. The last thing, take time to carefully plan and anticipate how to prevent challenges. If there's going to be something that's going to be a challenge, try to prevent it. If I needed technology for something, I want to make sure that the technology was ready. If I was going to have them do some reading, and I knew that they would come to that professional development, most likely a third of them hadn't done the reading, and that was going to cause some angst, I started the meeting 15 minutes later and said, anybody who wants to come 15 minutes ahead, I've got a highlighted version of the reading so you can quick get caught up on what you might have missed and not make them feel bad for having missed it. So really try to anticipate what could go wrong. You're going to get a chance right now to reflect on what we just talked about using a strategy that's from the book Energize Your Meetings that's called pluses and challenges. How you're going to do this is you're going to create a T chart. So it looks like this. Make a big T, and on the top of one side put a plus, and the top of the other one put a negative. What I want you to do is to take a minute before we get into our breakout to think of, kind of like Sandy had just shared, positives to using interactive learning structures, either in remote or in-person learning, and challenges. And when you get into your breakout session, you're going to share either a plus or a challenge in the same way you just did with the other swap meet that we did in the breakout session. I'm going to encourage you to try to keep your plus or challenge into a one-sentence share and have everybody share, but then give yourself time for discussion at the end. You might find you all have the same frustration, and that's real. Sometimes it's good to hear it. Sometimes somebody has a great idea. So I know whenever we're in breakout rooms, it seems like they just aren't enough time. But my thought is that probably a lot of you are in that same frustration mode that Sandy kind of said, where how to get everybody enjoying and being part of an interactive learning structure. Because just as I was saying before about having those people that are kind of the naysayers, having a few people that aren't engaged and wanting to be part of an interactive learning structure can kind of take away from our momentum to try to do that. And then you kind of just go back to the old sit and get. So as we wrap this up today, I'm just going to give you a few ideas that have been successful for other educators that I know that have tried to lead these type of activities with adults. Some that I have tried that I've found that have been real successful, and some that maybe are in your mind as well. Really be clear on the goal and the purpose of the interactive learning structure. Don't just pick one out of the book at the last minute and say, that one looks like fun, I think I'll do that. If you don't know what the goal and the purpose is, it could flop. And when you have one or two that don't go well, people aren't going to be engaged in wanting to do it. You don't have to have 30, I think this is 32 interactive learning structures. You don't have to have 32. Maybe there's 3 or 4 that your staff uses. Or maybe you just say, this year I'm going to try one. Get a start with it. And if it doesn't go well when you do it with the staff, that's okay to say, like, oh, wow, I'm learning from this. I'm going to try something else this time. I'm going to persevere. And it's because it's something I want you to value as well. And I know it's for the best learning that you have. But do, like I said before, beware of the staff climate. If something's going on, I remember one time I was doing a professional development setting on responsive classroom on 9/11. It was the morning of the towers going down. And I remember being in that library, leading that professional development, and realizing, wow, we are just going to have to totally change what we're doing from here on in. So respond to what's going on in your community, in your school, and really kind of take a pulse of the school as well. If you have some staff that have implemented some of these in their classrooms, bring them in as resources if they're willing to do it. if they're able to help support buy-in, or if you see one being used in the class, say, hey, I saw fifth graders doing this inside-outside circle, and I thought if fifth graders could do it, we could do it here in our staff meeting as well. And I saw how they were bought in. And that sense of resistance, create empathy for that, but also use it as a teaching moment. So you might say, I know some of you would prefer just to sit and get this information, and it's at the end of the day. And I also know the greatest learning is going to come if you get a chance to talk to your colleagues, and every voice needs to be heard. So that feeling that you're having right now and you're persevering through it, think about the students in your class that might be thinking the same thing, and have empathy for them and how you've persevered through it as well. A third thing below there where it says plan ahead, if you need a visual, if you need copies, if you need the computer up, have all those things ahead of time. And like I said before, think of traffic flow in a room. If people are going to move, if they bump into other people, they're not going to be happy campers. And you're going to want to make sure that if you need a larger room, or if you need to move people, move furniture out, do that ahead of time. I found it was really difficult to say to staff, oh, come in after you've worked all day and now let's move this room around and create a circle. Even though I'm sure they could do it, it would have just set the meeting up poorly. So I engaged my custodians every time we had a staff meeting, and custodian Mr. John would come in, oh, what kind of setup do you need today for your staff meeting? He'd ask me, do you need a circle? Do you need tables? What can I get for you so you're ready? Also, how are you gonna get everyone's attention? When you have them start engaging with people, you need to have and model a strategy to get attention. The good old responsive classroom's energy chime, have that available for you wherever you're doing your professional development as a model and a way to respectfully get attention. A hand raised is another way to do it. But model the use of that signal how you want them to use it with students. If you're putting your hand up or doing the chime and still talking and saying that, or looking visually frustrated by the look on your face, that same behavior they're going to get, and they're going to know what it feels like. Sometimes I'd have to follow up a hand signal with a verbal cue because not everybody could see it. I had a large staff that I worked with. So sometimes I'd have to say, need everyone's attention. And then after I get their attention, I might even say, I know once you're on a topic, it can be really hard to stop. And I really sense the positive energy you had. But I never did that when I had my hand up, because that would tell them, talk when you have your hand up. But that's not what we're trying to get them to do. Also be aware of the time frames. If in your agenda, you have 15 minutes for an interactive learning structure, make sure you can do it in 15 minutes. I would never encourage you to do it at the very end of a PD or a session, because if it goes over, and sometimes they do, you're going to get that sense of frustration. But again, great time to have empathy with people. If something does seem to go over and your time for your meeting, your professional development has come, it's okay to stop and say, we're going to stop right now. We're not going to go over with this meeting. I can tell there's a lot of interest and excitement about this. So I want one person from your group to email me tomorrow one conclusion that your group came up with, or something like that, so that you can still honor an ending for everyone. So as we wrap this together and just ways to support you, our organization has a number of resources. Like I said, Energize Your Meetings, and then the 2 that were for school-based. We also have a number of quick coaching guides that are just being developed, and some of them have been in place for quite a while. I like this one here because staff can use it, but then also it's good for us to learn the same information. They're basically like a folder with the similar information on the front of basic information and a reflection tool, and then new information on the inside of the folder, and then a planning tool on the back of it. These are sold in packets of 30 with a leader's guide, or a packet of 10 or individually. And as they become robust and we have more of them out there, I think they're going to be a really valuable, and they already are, but even a more valuable professional development tool for you to work with your staff and to help lead the work that you're doing. And finally, these are our social media sites. So if you're not on any of these now, feel free to just explore and see what's out there. And if you can join in with us, it's a great place for you to post things that are going well in your school or things that you're trying. We're also trying to have it be a little bit more robust. So if people do have questions, and post them on our Facebook page or perhaps in our Twitter or Instagram, to have a way to get back to people if they have some concerns as well. And I want to thank all of you for joining in this webinar. It's just been such a pleasure to have connecting ideas and thoughts and pictures. And I would love to have been in the same room with you to see a little bit more of everybody. I'm going to stop share now to see who's still here with all of us. And know that I really appreciate everything that you're doing, and want to send you on the rest of your school year and the start of your summer and start of your Memorial Weekend with just an appreciation, because all of you are what make the difference for all of our kids. I'm going to stay on for anyone who has any questions yet. Otherwise, feel free to log off and be on, but I'll stay on for about 10 more minutes if you have questions or thoughts that you want to share, and hopefully see all of you again sometime. Take care.